see him there stepping off of Air Force One. President Donald Trump is back in the United States a lot earlier than planned. He and top U.S. leaders are right now in the Situation Room this very morning, and the agenda, Israel and Iran. In fact, the president warning people to evacuate Tehran. Israel joined that warning to the 300,000 people living in Iran's capital. The president says he wants a real end to Iran's nuclear program, adding he wants more than just a ceasefire in the conflict. Listen.
Looking for better than a ceasefire.
For weeks, President Trump pushed Iran to re-enter talks on its nuclear program.
But they're not going to have a nuclear weapon. I hope their program's going to be wiped out long before that. But they're not going to have a nuclear weapon.
There's reports that you want to send the vice president and Steve Witkoff to meet with the Iranians and have discussions. Is that something you're considering?
Not sure yet. I may. Depends on what happens when I get back.
What specifically is better than a ceasefire? What are you looking for here?
An end, a real end.
So as top leaders gather in the Situation Room, we have team coverage. Ed O'Keefe is at the White House, and CBS News Middle East reporter Courtney Kealy monitoring the situation from New York. Ed, let's get to you first, where the situation seems very immediate there with all these leaders gathering there. The president says he wants a real end, not just a ceasefire. So is the administration showing their cards about what options are on the table to make that, quote, real end happen?
Well, the president has said, Reed, for the last several days that Iran knows they should be reaching out to the United States to finish that nuclear agreement that had been in the works and that was set to be the subject of conversations last weekend before Israel began bombing Iran. This morning, motorcading back from Joint Base Andrews to the White House, he made clear, I'm not the one seeking peace talks. Iran should be reaching out to us to try to sort this out. What he said overnight on his flight back from the G7 is, in essence, he's meeting today with his top national security officials, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Marco Rubio among them, to get a sense of what could happen next. There are questions about whether the U.S. military will get involved. So far, he has signaled that is not the plan. And obviously, he remains hopeful for a potential diplomatic solution. But as you heard him say there, not yet sure whether he can deploy Steve Witkoff or the vice president or one of them to meet with Iranian officials. So we know he is meeting this morning here to try to get a better sense of the situation from Washington, and we are likely to hear from him later today, depending on how events play out there between Israel and Iran in the Middle East.
Yeah, those Situation Room meetings, as you know, are high stakes and closed door, but as we try to get an idea of the president's thinking on this matter, he said a few things overnight on social media on his platform about Iran. He called for that real end to the program. He said he's not asking for peace talks. So walk us through exactly what he said on social media.
Well, among other things, he was suggesting that Iran had the opportunity to talk to the United States and didn't necessarily take it when it could have, and also made clear that any suggestion that he was coming back here to work on a ceasefire between Iran and Israel is not true. But here's perhaps the critical one. I have not reached out, he said, to Iran for peace talks in any way, shape, or form, suggesting that reports that have said that are incorrect. They know how to reach me. They should have taken the deal that was on the table, would have saved a lot of lives. Remember, he said in recent days, Iran essentially had 61 days to reach out. They hadn't done that by the weekend, and they should continue considering to do that. But we know of no diplomatic outreach, at least between Iran and the United States so far, to potentially restart those talks. So again, this is one of those days where we got to sit and wait. He is meeting with his officials. He's conferring with the Israelis, undoubtedly. We're going to see what happens in the skies over those two countries, and then potentially how the United States reacts.
Some reporting yesterday on CBS News 24/7 looking at the depth of Iran's nuclear program underground mentioned that there's the potentiality that Israel may consider sending in ground troops. But there's been no discussion about U.S. troops getting involved in any sense whatsoever. Is there any change where that thinking is concerned relative to U.S. troops?
We are unaware of any public discussion of that by the president, who so far has ruled it out publicly. And so far, at least, no awareness of private or behind-the-scenes conversations about it. Obviously, there are U.S. military deployed across the region. There are naval vessels. There are military aircraft based at bases in places like Bahrain, inside other countries there. Qatar, of course, another one. So there's undoubtedly plenty of assets there should they be needed. And others, of course, in the Persian Gulf and in the Mediterranean Sea monitoring the situation there. Not only that, but of course, what the Houthis had been up to in Yemen, the situation in Gaza as well. So there are options should he want to consider them. But again, as of now, no signs that the U.S. military is directly involved. And in fact, last night when the president warned on social media that Tehran should evacuate, there were then statements on social media by people not in the know that perhaps the U.S. military was now directly engaged. And very quickly, the Pentagon and the White House, other administration officials made clear that is not the situation. There was no direct military involvement again last night with what Israel unloaded on Iran. Reed.
CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much. We know it's a high-stakes day right there where you are, if those walls could only talk. All right, so the mega million-dollar question as we set the table today on this story, can President Trump realistically keep the U.S. out of the fight? CBS News Middle East reporter Courtney Kealy monitoring the situation all through the night. So, Courtney, the goal, as the president states, is to wipe out Iran's nuclear capability. Some of their infrastructure is underground. So let's get back to that conversation we started with Ed O'Keefe. There's those underground facilities. To really hit those hard, Iran knows that Israel would have to use bunker bombs that only the United States has. Are we getting any closer to the conversation that perhaps the U.S. could give those bombs and deploy those into use to get deeper in Iran's resources?
Right, that would be the billion-dollar question. It would be a B-2 bomber that only the U.S. has, and it would be one of those 30,000-pound bombs that would be needed to penetrate the Fordo nuclear plant. I am hearing from the IAE chief, Rafael Grossi, that Natanz is showing damage, according to high-resolution satellite imagery, that they're looking at that nuclear plant. The centrifuges, they say, most likely damaged. The centrifuges are key in spinning to make a nuclear bomb, and they're also talking about there's no radioactivity on the ground, but inside the plant of Natanz, the power is gone, and the power generators, which means that they can't control the power and what level they would be processing anything at. So they're saying where protective equipment will be necessary for contamination inside, above ground for civilians, it's okay. But Fordo, no news that we're hearing anything from the IAEA, which does often give those reports. We're not hearing anything new from them, as they said, on Isfahan either, although the Isfahan plant, there was some damage. There were also damage to the oil refinery, so you see these big clouds of smoke that we just saw on screen. That's gas facilities, oil facilities as well. Ballistic missile depots. They took about a third of their ballistic missile capability out already. Israel did that with Iran. So in terms of not just the nuclear, but the ballistic missiles, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it clear that he wants both. An Iranian nuclear deal would have only addressed nuclear, but would have not addressed ballistic. And now Netanyahu, in his militaristic way, is addressing both.
Well, we know your contacts in the Middle East are deep, and so a lot of people are also looking at that warning for people to leave Tehran. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Talk to me about the situation there. Does it look like people are heeding that warning, and what does the warning communicate about plans going forward?
Right, and that warning doesn't come from Iranian regime early warning system. They don't have anything, no sirens like they have across Israel to announce to people to seek shelter, and no places to shelter. So you saw those just streaming lines and overnight in the darkness, snaking all over and out of Tehran. We're talking approximately 10 million people, and where do they go? Where do they seek shelter otherwise? These are happening all over Iran, these strikes.
So as you look at the chessboard, so to speak, you've got U.S. leaders in the Situation Room, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, no doubt also talking to his leaders. You see so many people trying to leave Tehran. And that really amps up the tension, the ticking clock of this story. So the big question, I think, is, Are there any diplomatic solutions still on the table for any of those leaders and in any of those really high priority, high asset meetings that are happening at this hour?
Right, like will Netanyahu pull the reins? Will he stop this now? He doesn't have anything left to lose in terms of his own political career, and so diplomatically he's diverting from Gaza, and he's also doing what he said he wanted to do since the 90s. But you do have Iran reaching out to Saudi Arabia yesterday, Oman as well, and Qatar, and we do have a U.S. Air Force base in Qatar. So reaching out on those, 3 different countries asking for help. We haven't heard of any effective diplomacy. And hearing President Trump's words, there's going to be a complete end to this. It doesn't sound very diplomatic. He has kept that open throughout the last 5 days, especially over the weekend when the messaging came from the White House that they had, quote, vetoed the attacking the regime leader, the Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, but they didn't. And whether that's true or not, or that's subject to change, remains unclear. All we can go by is President Trump's words, and we're going also by the Iranian foreign minister, who has put out messaging in the last 24 hours or so, 48 hours, that they're willing to negotiate. But what they can negotiate at this point is very unclear, and how. And also, most of the top leadership in the military and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has been taken out, even some of the deputies replaced. That was Netanyahu's militaristic strategy with Hezbollah. He took them out methodically. He's done that to Hamas, and he's doing that in real time within 5 days to all the top leaders and the top military intelligence. That speaks to the supreme leader. So whether he's still has people around him giving him the right information or not is also a big question mark.
Well, as news breaks in Israel, Iran, and anywhere in the Middle East, Courtney Kealy, we are glad that you are right there on standby to bring it to us. Thank you so much for that update. Tense times there.